Hello, and welcome to The Mind of a Therapist, a podcast where I interview psychotherapists and helping professionals on what they're passionate about in order to provide you with messages of encouragement and hope. I'm your host, Andrew Earl. The Mind of a Therapist is sponsored by Psychological Counseling Services, Healing Hearts and Transforming Lives. Look into our intensive at pcsintensive.com. In today's interview, I interviewed Dr. Jamie Marich. Jamie describes herself as a facilitator of transformative experiences, a clinical trauma specialist, expressive artist, writer, yoga teacher, performer, short filmmaker, Reiki master, TEDx speaker, and recovery advocate. She unites all of these elements in her mission to inspire healing in others. She began her career as a humanitarian aid worker in Bosnia-Herzegovina from 2000 to 2003, primarily teaching English and music while freelancing with other projects. Jamie travels internationally teaching on topics related to trauma, EMDR therapy, expressive arts, mindfulness, and yoga, while maintaining a private practice and online education operations in her home base of Northeast Ohio. Jamie is the author of numerous books on trauma, recovery, and healing, with many more projects in the works. And you'll find links to her books in the show notes. So without further ado, here's my interview with Jamie. Well, Jamie, thanks for being on the podcast today. The question I like to start off with is, what's your take on change? How do you view change? What does it take for somebody to change, and or what does it take for systems to change?
This answer is going to sound a little bland, yet this is an amazing question I haven't been asked in quite some time. And I'm thinking on both my own life and what I've seen in other people's lives. I do think pain is one of the greatest motivators for change. When something is causing enough pain or stinks, or if I can use plain language, sucks for too long, I do think that is one of the greatest motivators to get us into action. I do believe that motivation can be both intrinsic and extrinsic, because I really resist this narrative that it all has to come from within, because sometimes another person you care about saying just the right thing can help you to at least consider the bigger picture of how your behavior, how your life might be adversely impacting others. So while I think motivation can come from a lot of places, I do fundamentally think it is pain that leads most people we work with there. And how do I get out of this rut of being stuck in that pain that's keeping me from flourishing and achieving success as I define it?
So it's that pain. It could be extrinsic factors as well as intrinsic factors that lead one and kind of serve as that impetus for change.
That's pretty fair assessment.
Yeah. And then I know you have training in EMDR, mindfulness, these sorts of approaches ground your work. Would you talk a bit about what do you see as some of the more effective interventions or approaches to helping someone when they're coming to you stuck in that pain, stuck in that place? What are some of the helpful, it's a big question, but some of those helpful factors?
It's a big question, yet one I spend a lot of time thinking about and looking at. And it's a question that I asked the contributors to one of my more recent books, Dissociation Made Simple, about. What is it that helped you make the changes that you wanted to see? So it is kind of a both and answer, because on one hand, I certainly have my opinions and my lived experience about what I think works best. And that would be body-based interventions that address a person's entire internal world and system, or parts as we may think of it. So for me, EMDR therapy has long been my main jam, so to speak, because it worked so well for me as a client. And I felt the passion to learn it and to share it with my clients and now to teach it with others. Yet I am not somebody who purports EMDR ever to be a panacea. It's the one thing we all need, and we have to run out and get trained in it, and all of us. And because I think there's a lot of things that can work, whatever brings about genuine transformation, and that can differ person to person. And I certainly also have my opinions that therapies that are more embodied, more parts conscious, I think IFS does it for a lot of people. I'm also an expressive arts therapist, and the expressive and creative modalities really do it well. Yet, if I look at the last several years I've spent digging into this question myself, especially with people who contributed to my book Dissociation Made Simple, which was a informal research project essentially that I did in writing the book. I asked the same question: what was it that brought about change? And many different modalities were flagged by the contributors, the 61 contributors to that book, most of whom had a specific dissociative disorder. And something I saw both in that project and also what I've experienced in my own life and seen in my clients' lives, it's rarely one thing. For instance, I can point to EMDR as being what was arguably the game changer in my healing. Yet prior to that, it was expressive arts and 12-step recovery. And since that, I've also experimented with or explored some other healing modalities. I have a yoga practice, other spiritual endeavors have taken me there as well. So I think it's a combination of factors. I will say a common denominator in all of this that some of the contributors highlighted, and that I certainly believe, is that there is good relational attunement between the person who's doing the guiding, who's offering the therapy, who's offering the healing service, and the person who's receiving it. I don't think we address that enough in modern psychotherapy. We may give it some lip service here and there, but modern psychotherapy can be so, let's get the right technique, let's get the training
Yes.
technique. And we lose a lot of the art of this craft of ours that makes it special, and that is relational attunement.
Well, what you're saying, I think, has been a big theme in my interviews on this podcast of the importance of relational attunement for people and supporting
Mm-hmm.
their healing process. And then also what you were saying of Irvin Yalom, I forget exactly how he languages it, but fellow journey or like this perspective that we're all in a healing journey, and it's not just one thing. Like EMDR,
Mm-hmm.
EMDR is such a powerful tool, right, for helping someone do this deep work to really get to the core of the stuckness. And it's a tool in a long-term process. In our society, there's this zeitgeist of there's this is the cure-all, right? This is the cure-all, and I think that that's infiltrated psychotherapy world, and so we get so excited about all these models. And what I'm hearing is you saying is that maybe that can get in the way of the foundational attunement that is that relational spiritual connection we have with people that catalyzes.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up Dr. Yalom. One of my favorite quotes of his from The Gift of Therapy is that therapy should be relationship driven, not theory driven.
Mm.
And I put that right in my program's training manual for EMDR therapy, that even though we're spending all these days learning a pretty sophisticated technique, please don't lose sight of that imperative he so beautifully names.
Well, in talking about EMDR, I'd like to talk about EMDR. I'd also like to talk a
Sure.
bit about movement and embodiment practices as well, because I know that's been an area of focus for you. With EMDR, so many people, it has such a profound experience and so many healing experiences. From your perspective as someone who's been immersed in the work, who's experienced it, who teaches it, who practices it, what is it about EMDR in particular that is so helpful for people?
Wow. I, I again, I have my beliefs based on what I've seen. And my answer might surprise EMDR enthusiasts, because a lot of what we emphasize as being the most helpful is whatever this bilateral process is with the eyes or the tones or the tapping, it's doing something super sophisticated in the brain that helps us shift how information is stored. Yes, to all of that. I think the other mechanisms at play with EMDR, though, mindfulness is a big one because so much of EMDR therapy is about notice it, go with it without having to analyze it to death or talking to death. So we invite a person to essentially be quiet with something as the bilateral dual tension stimulus and the EMDR technique is applied. Yet I think there's a lot of power in simply sitting with something that's coming up because so much of modern Western psychotherapy is let's piece it apart. Let's challenge the cognitions. Let's talk. And even when new trainees come into the EMDR process, they're often surprised by how little we talk. And many of my new students will, but I want to ask more questions. I need more detail. And a question I commonly return with is, do you? Or have you been trained to think that you do? So I think that's part of the power of EMDR, as is even the initial setup in the EMDR protocol is multi-sensory, multi-channeled, that we're not just in the cognitive realm. We ask questions about the body. We do ask questions about cognitions. There is more cognition than you may think in EMDR therapy. We ask about images, other sensory details. So I really also feel all channels of experience are honored in EMDR therapy. And it is really a beautiful multimodal approach that Shapiro was able to tie together.
So what I'm hearing is holding this space for a person to really connect with all aspects of their experience, with the parts of them that are more thinking parts, the emotion, their sensory experience, and that's a pillar of the what you see as the effectiveness of EMDR.
And an early interview, even with Dr. Shapiro, that I heard is that all modalities are honored in EMDR. So if you are more psychodynamic, if you're more body centered, if you're more cognitive, if you're more experiential, and I know that's an early criticism she took, that she just did some good blending with this therapy. And yeah, she blended it really well, is my feeling. And this idea of the bilateral dual attention stimulus is doing something to accelerate uh, mindful practice, is doing something to accelerate this convergence that we're talking about. So we love it. I mean, it is what really helped us to get well after a lot of years of being unwell, even after 2-3 years into our journey with sobriety and recovery, yet still feeling stuck in many different ways. It was the time to do some deeper trauma work, and EMDR facilitated that in a way that, and I always want to be careful, especially since if I'm talking to an audience of wider therapists, I'm not saying cognitive interventions are all bad or that 12-step interventions are all bad. They are what I was open to and what I needed at the time. Yet something else was clearly needed to get deeper.
Yeah. And I think that's part of the reason I was drawn to your work, invited you on the podcast, is I just appreciate in hearing you in other podcasts you've done and your TED Talk. It's this, it seems like you just hold space for whatever works for people, right? And it's not as black and white thinking. Some model developers can kind of get into that in the psycho leaders
Oh,
in the
yes.
field. And so I appreciate the grayness and the flexibility.
And something we're really coming to understand about success or therapeutic goals, they are how the individual or the system defines them.
Yes.
And honestly, that is something we learned from Dr. Shapiro. One of her most common teachings is that the purpose of EMDR therapy is to help people live a more adaptive life. And adaptive is a word she went with over healthy or good because there was less value judgment in it.
I like that.
And yeah, and how I'm learning to translate that into more general terms is therapeutic, healing, spiritual success is however you define it, whatever is helping you to flourish in life in a way that works for you. So thank you for recognizing that in my work. It means a lot.
Yeah. And that is so important, isn't it, when we're in therapeutic relationships, that we're really honoring and continuing to track back to what does this person really want?
Mhm.
What is their goal? And then everything we do is anchored in supporting them and moving in that direction, given our
100%.
orientation.
Yep.
Yeah. I wanted to shift to you've co-authored a book on jujitsu. You're a guitarist. You have, I think, incorporated dance into
Yes.
your psychotherapy. Could you talk a bit about what led you to write and think and incorporate these more movement oriented, more artistic oriented approaches into your work?
A great question. And a huge part of the answer is it just has made sense to me because as a kid, growing up with a lot of stuff going on around me and within me, the arts were there.
Mm.
I give a lot of credit to both of my parents, even with some of their other issues that impacted my life adversely, that both were musicians. My mom was a dancer, and they exposed me to the arts very young. And probably some of my earliest healing work I would do was going down into the basement where I had a playroom at my parents' house, and I had an old Mickey Mouse record player and would play music and dance around and
Oh,
put on
wow.
scenes for plays. And even doing that play in my own little world down there gave me an outlet before I even knew that I needed therapeutic healing. And I did a lot of theater and speech and writing and music, as you mentioned. And I think where it gave me an advantage when I needed to get sober and really heal is emotions didn't scare me because I at least had some outlets that I was already working with to express them. I also started my career in human services in the country of Bosnia Herzegovina, where there was a war. My family's Croatian background from that part of the world. And so I went there after my undergraduate, primarily teaching English and music, and I saw how powerful music and dance and movement and other creative arts were at helping me to teach English.
Oh,
And it really then started translating into healing work I was doing with others. I remember my first internship site. I had this supervisor who, bless her heart, I described her as too burnt out to care. And when I started my internship, she goes, "Oh, you're a musician, you do expressive things, do that with our kids. That's fine." And I really had an opportunity from the earliest days of my career to start bringing in expressive practice. Then I eventually received more formal training in it. And a lot of also, especially how the jujitsu entered my life, is an embrace of this whatever works philosophy that we're discussing. And at that point, I already had a lot of expressive practice. I had much EMDR. I had a yoga practice. My stepsons were training jujitsu, and something about it both scared me and intrigued me. And I started taking some lessons with the real trauma informed coach. And it helped me to see just how much martial arts were needed to do that layer of my healing work, to learn that I literally could get a stronger force off of me if I needed to, because that's so much of what jujitsu practice is about, is empowering people who maybe don't traditionally see themselves as so strong to be able to get out of tricky situations by using body leverage as opposed to body strength. So it was just full of so many healing moments for me. I don't practice so actively because of an injury now, yet I still
yeah.
have a yoga practice and dance, and expression and body movement is always going to be a part of my life as my body and spirit will allow me to be. Yeah.
Wow. Well, I'm just excited with you sharing all those things because I've, in my life, guitar, you talking about being in the basement and just dancing and expressing emotion for me. When I was in high school, I really started playing guitar a lot, and I would
Mm,
just be in my room for hours and hours, wouldn't even notice. But yeah, a huge part of why I kept going back to it was just I had been holding
mhm.
so much in for so much of my life and my childhood. There's so much emotion that at that point had not been expressed at all, and in the guitar it was just So it's such a nice reminder you talking there of how powerful those artistic outlets are, and then jujitsu I'm hearing was the focus is okay, someone maybe have more brute force than you,
Mm-hmm.
but you can learn through techniques to counter that brute
Yes.
force and
Mm-hmm.
protect yourself. And if you would be willing to share, or were there are there a few moments that you look back on that were really moving to you in your learning and practice that you'd be willing to talk about?
Yeah, 100%. Literally learning that I can get a scary man off of me, because a lot of what male physical strength and force represents to me is assault, is domination. And yeah, there's a particular technique. It's almost, if anybody's listening to this practices martial arts or jujitsu, you likely know the trap and roll technique, where, yeah, somebody's on top of you and you're taught how to use your body positioning, how to get your feet and your arms just right, and then lifting your hips ever just so to be able to roll the individual off of you. And I learned how to do that with my coaches. And eventually, because my ex husband, who represented a marriage I had to get out of, he was helping me with some training because he was taking some jujitsu as well. And literally being able to get him off of me
Wow.
was a huge turning point in me being able to leave a marriage I needed to. And yeah, there was also just something about jujitsu, as especially as I was first learning it, made my body come alive in a way that it really hadn't yet,
Huh.
and that was very needed.
Do you attribute it allowing your body to come alive to those pieces you were talking about of being able to literally get
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, yeah.
yeah. I think that was part of it, but I really think any embodied practice that helps you move energy, if that's which that resonates with you, because I've certainly had a lot of those moments during yoga and dance. As my knees allow, I also like to hike, and after a really good hike, I'll feel that as well.
Mm,
Uh, so I think it's all about what's going to cause movement.
yeah,
Movement that, yes, can be literal movement, yet it can be energetic movement as
yeah.
well. Sometimes that happens to me when I'm really just engaged in the process of painting or writing.
Wow. And I have this image of the you know, prey like a zebra or a deer of some sort who had a near miss attack, just shaking, and how natural that is for animals when they experience pain or trauma to shake and release. And then also coming to mind when I was in grad school, I took a play therapy course, and my therapy instructor had brought a video of her doing play therapy with this little boy, probably 5 years old, 6 years old, and she gave him a phone book just to rip, and he
Mhm,
just that release
mhm.
of what's inside, I think is so needed for so I know for myself, and I'm hearing for you and a lot of people who have experienced trauma, and yet there's not, even in psychotherapy, right? There's often not that space to really
Mhm.
physically release that energy.
I think the way a lot of us are trained in traditional Western psychotherapy programs, yes, because it is all about the head and cognitions and words. Now, other modalities, somatic experiencing, sensory motor comes to mind, obviously, dance movement therapy, expressive arts therapy. We're doing this kind of work. Even more somatically engaged EMDR therapists are doing this kind of work. And it's vital, and I wish it was more mainstream in how we educate therapists.
Yeah. And another question I had for you was you've authored and co-authored a number of books, and I'm curious, as someone who has created so much content in the field of therapy and looking back at these different works of yours, is there one in particular that you kind of look back on and you say that one's really really is, I don't know, special to you, has a special place in your heart, you hold dear?
It's like asking you to pick your favorite children.
Or maybe
No, it's
a
a great
better
question.
way, if the listener was interested in reading one of your books, what
Yeah, no,
book would you want them to start with?
it's a great question. And I would want them to start with Dissociation Made Simple, which is a book I've talked about a few times on this interview so far. Just came out early 2023. I always say, at least for me, my favorite book is the most recent one that I've worked on because it represents the growth that I've learned from a lot of the other different books. So Dissociation Made Simple is a good overview for especially any therapist. Yet I did write it more for a general audience wanting to learn more about dissociation. And my message to therapists is you got to do this work yourself too. So it's a book that I see as for everyone. If people are interested more in addiction recovery issues, I would say my Trauma and the 12 Steps book, which I originally wrote in 2012, was rebooted in 2020, and then a manual came out this year, our workbook that people can use with it. I'm currently working on my spiritual abuse and religious trauma journey memoir called You Lied to Me About God. That'll be out in October of 2024. And that's caused me to do a lot of my deep digging further because this is, even though I do get personal in a lot of my books, this is a pure memoir, and it's
Mm,
been a transformative process for me to write it.
wow. I can tell uh, in by the research I did before having this conversation and now in our conversation how much work you've done personally. Hearing you did your own psychotherapy work. For those who are listening who are maybe therapists who haven't, or others who are maybe interested in psychotherapy, um, what would be the case? Would you make a case, I guess, first for therapists doing their own work? And if so, where would be the first places you'd recommend people look into to start?
Well, I think doing your own work is essential. And going back to Yalom, who we've talked about already, in a talk I heard him give in 2016, he said, good therapists get their own therapy usually 2 or 3 times throughout their career. And I loved that. Personally, for me, I have stayed connected to professional receiving my own EMDR and professional therapy over the years. I sometimes don't need it as frequently as other times in my life. And I also don't think therapy is the be all and end all of healing. Like I talked about my jujitsu journey, that was a huge way that I did a good chunk of my work. And that was with a former MMA fighter who had a lot to say and offer about healing. For many people, it is yoga or healthy spiritual practice. It can be getting into an expressive art yourself. Some people, if you're in a really good book club, that might be it. So I think back to something my first recovery mentor and sponsor taught me, that if a flower stops growing, the only direction it can go then is to wilt and then die. And so, metaphorically speaking, I've embraced that over the years as what am I doing to continue to nourish myself? And even if it feels big to think of it as like I constantly have to be in therapy, I know I do have to be constantly taking care of myself. And I've taken that very seriously over the years.
And I love that you expand that outside of psychotherapy because you're so right. All these other modalities can be so healing, and that can look so diverse for people like we were talking about earlier, depending on where they're at, what their goals are. And I know Scott Miller has talked about how in the general public too, people have a lot more optimism at times about other spiritual healers or other models of healing helping them versus therapy.
Mhm. And so again, it goes back to self-determination as a factor of this. Defining an adaptive life or success can vary from person to person. And I always encourage folks to consider that people have been healing and helping each other before professional Western psychotherapy existed.
Yeah.
So keep an open mind and an open heart to what it is that's going to help you water that flower, so to speak.
Yeah. You're talking about your new book on dissociation, and will you define? I think quite a few of our listeners will be familiar, but for those of our listeners who aren't familiar with disassociation, would you define disassociation?
So dissociation simply means to sever or to divide.
Mm-hmm.
It's the root origin, it's where it comes from. And what is it we're severing or dividing from? It's usually the present moment because the present moment is unpleasant, overwhelming, painful. And a lot of times that severing can be in the form of we're disconnected, we're cut off from parts or aspects of ourselves. And dissociation typically happens for one of two reasons: to either meet the needs that aren't being met inside or to protect, to meet a need. So that's the nutshell definition, and it expresses in many different ways. It's often taught as something that can happen on a continuum from the types of dissociation we all do, like daydreaming and zoning out. And then those of us with complex trauma histories may leverage it more intensely. And yeah, that's the very much the nutshell definition. And if that's intriguing to people, I'd encourage you to check out Dissociation Made Simple.
Yeah, that's great. And you said dissociation is often dissociation from uh, that extreme experience of trauma or pain that someone is it's a cutting off. And you earlier you were talking about how EMDR is focused on supporting people to connect with their experience. So it seems like that's a great antidote, as well as all of these physical movement modalities we've been talking about. Um,
Yeah, whatever
yeah,
helps us get to know ourselves better.
yeah,
And for maybe those parts or aspects of experience that are cut off to meet each other.
yeah, absolutely. And you did a TED talk that I'll link in the show notes. I
Great.
highly recommend people check out. And you talked about how trauma is the root of a lot of the geopolitical conflicts that we're seeing, a lot of the problems we see in the world, and curious
Mhm.
if you could just speak a bit more about that.
Well, how much time do I have? I know we're
Right.
it goes to the fundamental principle that you may have heard it expressed this way, that hurt people hurt people.
Mm,
How I express it in the TED Talk is trauma means wound. And the TED Talk is called Healing the Wounds That Keep Us Stuck.
mm,
And when wounds don't heal, yeah, they can cause distress in our own lives, but then we also have this tendency to bleed all over each other.
mhm,
And almost any geopolitical conflict I have studied, that's the case, where you have not just two sides of a story, but many different sides of a story. And people are transferring a lot of their hurts and ills and shames onto each other.
mm,
We see it happen in families, we see it happen in communities, we see it happen within countries, we see it happen between countries and nations. And that's the short answer. I would say if any of that is picking a seed or planting a seed in your brain, look at it further.
yeah,
Look at it further.
yeah. Well, that certainly resonates with my own experience and own worldview, and curious to talk just a bit more about the healing power of the creative arts. You know, you talked about movement in and of itself, the releasing of energy, expression being healing. Are there any other pieces of dance, of musical expression that you see as being helpful and healing as people are moving through their healing journeys?
So, expressive arts therapy, by definition, embraces what's called a multimodal approach, meaning that it could be all of those things you just said, whatever's going to give you an outlet to share what you've been holding in. And for some people, that's filmmaking, that is creating social art on TikTok, that's gardening, that's cooking, that's hair design. So, my definition of creative and expressive arts is very broad. It's whatever is going to help you get out what has been held down.
That's good. Well, Jamie, we're getting to the end of the interview. Thanks again for being on the podcast today. And before I get to the last question, I ask guests, where can people learn more about your work and get in touch with you if what you're sharing is resonating with them?
Yeah, so the easiest couple, I have a couple web presences. JamieMarich.com, my name.com is my overall website that links you to my various projects. I have two more for the public resources sites out there, traumamadesimple.com and redefinetherapy.com. And my business for EMDR training is Institute for Creative Mindfulness. So if you're a therapist interested in doing EMDR basic or advanced training, check us out there, because we now do a lot of those offerings online. So you can access even working directly with me wherever you're at in the country or the world.
That's great. And then the last question I generally pose to guests is, what's a message of hope you'd like to leave the listeners with today?
Keep taking care of yourselves. To use the line I said a few minutes ago, keep watering the flower, keep tending the soil, because you are born to flourish, however you, as we said with success, however you define it. And a lot of what keeps us stuck is not just the wounds that we need to heal or address, but the fact that we just can push without really giving ourselves what we need to be that healthy flower. So that's my message to kind of put a bow on this today.
Yeah. Well, as a gardener myself, that resonates with me, the importance of nurturing the soil. That's foundational for our survival, and that's true for ourselves as well.
So happy to be here, and thank you for asking such good questions.
Thank you, Jamie. Please press the subscribe button, as well as rating and reviewing our podcast. This helps others connect with what you've been hearing. If you have any questions, please contact us at themindofitherapist@gmail.com. These questions will be kept anonymous. I want to thank Eric Price for the wonderful music you hear in this podcast. Additionally, this podcast was created to provide accurate and authoritative information on the subject matter. Although we are interviewing licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to serve as direct medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for direct professional help. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, publisher, guests, or PCS are rendering legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you need a professional, we encourage you to find one. Visit Psychology Today to connect with a licensed clinician near you.